Though the history of racial covenants has been largely obscured from the public's view, the impacts of this unfair housing practice have been salient and long-lasting.
These covenants had the effect of racializing neighborhoods. And then, of course, there's other things that are attached to that, like the ways that certain parts of certain communities are invested in and the ways that some communities are divested, meaning resources are put into certain communities and people living in those communities benefit from them. And those benefits are handed on and passed on from generation to generation.
So after racial covenants were made illegal by the Fair Housing Act of 1968, at the same time, the federal government was desegregating the workforce. And so in the 1960s, you would have seen institutions like the VA begin to hire African Americans in St. Cloud. But because African Americans in particular had so few opportunities in St. Cloud for so long, had been prohibited, of course, from purchasing property through racial covenants, it really put that group of people in particular at a disadvantage, because when African Americans began populating St. Cloud in the 1960s and the decades after, they didn't have access to that generational wealth and presence that people of European descent had in St. Cloud. So today, St. Cloud is much more diverse than it was in the past, but we do see many of the generational effects of the history of segregation, racial covenants, redlining, steering, not employing people who weren't white. All of the different mechanisms of segregation continue to affect St. Cloud today. For the nation as a whole, I mean, there's been so much research about just the generational effects of racial covenants and other forms of legal segregation. And what others have found in terms of the nation is that racial covenants prevented people from minoritized groups from being able to buy and sell and pass on property. And we know that in the United States that homeownership is a driver of wealth, of generational wealth in particular. And so racial covenants nationwide kept neighborhoods segregated along racial lines, made it so that particular groups of people, so particularly African Americans and other minoritized groups, it made it difficult to impossible for those groups to access that generational wealth and then pass it on, which created home ownership gaps that still exist to this day, wealth gaps that still exist to this day, lack of access to jobs, even health outcomes. Many of the segregated neighborhoods, those that were reserved for white people, would have been in places that had access to good schools, to parks, to green space, whereas neighborhoods where African American or other minoritized groups were forced to live would have been close to industrial plants or water that was polluted or not having access to good schools or to green space. And so in all of those ways, that history of legal segregation and discrimination continues to reverberate in American life and in the perpetuation of racial inequality to this day. In Stearns County, in the St. Cloud area, St. Cloud has one of the highest racial homeownership gaps in the country. So in the city of St. Cloud, for the Black population in particular, the Black homeownership rate is only 8% compared to 72% for white residents of St. Cloud. So even though racial covenants are now illegal and no longer are enforceable, we see that the effects of this generational wealth or lack of it continues to play out to this day.
I want people to know about racial covenants that their impact is long-lasting. You can't develop a reputation for having a neighborhood that was intolerant for generations and then expect that reputation to go away as soon as you have the Civil Rights Act of 1968, and then everything's supposed to be fair and square, and people are supposed to feel comfortable moving into that neighborhood that did not want them only a short while earlier. Reputations are hard to overcome, and that's one unfortunate legacy of the covenants. Another, again, goes back to being denied wealth that comes from home ownership. So part of the wealth gap that exists today comes from the generations of people who were denied access to buying a house. And even though the Civil Rights Act of '68 was passed 56 years ago, it takes a while to undo generations of damage like that.
Though generations of damage cannot simply be undone, people can take direct action against these antiquated and unjust housing practices by identifying and discharging racial covenants from their housing deeds. It isn't easy to address and remedy this aspect of U.S. history, but it cannot be ignored. Increasing education and awareness on this topic are extremely effective courses of action. In learning about the history of racial covenants, we can begin to understand the larger, overarching story of racial discrimination in the U.S. Hopefully, this increased understanding will help prevent the history from repeating itself.
Well, I think going forward, the best way to educate about racial covenants is just to have the space to say that these existed and to not necessarily be afraid of hurting people's feelings just by mentioning the fact that they existed. It is important to know your community and to know the history of it, to know the history of certain neighborhoods, including the neighborhood where you live. If you've ever wondered why your community or your neighborhood has the demographics that it does, covenants might be a part of that. They might not. But it doesn't hurt to just do the research and find out so that you know for yourself and you can speak with knowledge instead of ignorance about where you live.
Yes, and I want people to know that those kind of covenants existed, and that's why certain neighborhoods developed the way they did, and how that puts such a restriction on what's known as inherited wealth. People couldn't own homes in this neighborhood even if they could afford them. They weren't allowed to buy them.
It's easy for us to look back and make judgments about people, but they were products of their time as well. And the European immigrants coming over and pushing the Native Americans farther and farther and farther west. And it's part of our heritage, it's part of our history. It can't be ignored, but it's important for it to be understood.